welcome to LubeTrends. I see that we are still, participants, registrants are still queuing up, so we're going to give them a few minutes to get everyone logged in. I want to thank Kline for agreeing to participate today. Now, as you all know, originally this session was planned for the annual meeting, but we all know what happened with that, unfortunately. But we're excited to finally present the results of the study, this long-awaited information that is going to be key for members to use in planning for the future of their businesses over the next few years. Give it just a couple of minutes. We have quite a few people still logging on. Welcome to LubeTrends. I want to thank Chevron Ornite, who's been our longtime sponsor of the LubeTrends town halls, both at the meeting live and virtual. They've been our sponsor for the last 2 years. Thank you very much, Chevron Ornite, for being our longtime sponsor. For those of you who may not know this, ILMA some time ago commissioned a study to look at the impact of electrification on PCMO and metalworking fluid demand. And we had planned to present the results of the study, the first segment of it at the annual meeting, but unfortunately the annual meeting was canceled. So now we're presenting them today. I want to thank Kline Group, their energy practice. They were the candidate, they were the consultant chosen to conduct the study. And they're here today to present the results. And I'm just going to quickly introduce the members of the energy practice. Annie Harkeen is the vice president. We also have Jason Moncrief, who is a senior consultant. Constantine, I'm going to try to pronounce your name. Melnichuk, is that correct?
That's perfect.
Okay, and he is the director of the energy practice. And finally, Gabrielle Tarl. He's joining us today as a senior consultant. Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to turn it over to Annie now.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks for the introduction. As you said, it's a pleasure to finally get to this point to sharing this really exciting research today. And of course, a shame not to be delivering it in person, but there's a couple of pretty good benefits of doing it on this virtual forum. One is you can see the size of the presenting team has doubled. So as Holly mentioned, alongside Jason, who would have been leading the presentation in Florida, we have Constantine and Gabrielle, who were, these three guys were really the core team, with Constantine leading it, developing this research and analysis. So it's actually really exciting that we can all be here and we can leverage all the knowledge of the team, both in presenting and also in the Q&A session afterwards. So that's really, really great. Another benefit is the Q&A feature in the Zoom function. So please at any point do ask any questions, even if they're sort of quite tactical. I don't understand that acronym, or please clarify, so that you really understand the slide as it's been presented. And those of us not presenting at that time will be sure to sort of interrupt and make sure we clarify. Also, at the same time, as we go, please do ask any questions that come to mind. We will probably hold them and then curate them for the end, where Holly will host the Q&A session. So we really, look forward to lots of questions. So please go ahead. A little bit of background into the study. As Holly said, we were engaged by ILMA to do this work on the impact of electrification. As I'm sure you all know, the impact of electrification on PCMO has been, widely discussed and debated for years. The key point of debate is really around the pace of this electrification of the vehicle park. And, there's a lot of uncertainty around how fast that's going to happen. And it, of course, differs by market, from the US to Germany to China to any market. Really, the fundamentals in that market do differ. Whether it's the ability of the electric vehicle OEM to produce enough vehicles, maybe there's supply chain disruptions, shortages in precious metals, or local government regulations and targets that are set and changed over time. OEM targets and how they're what they're projecting in terms of when they plan to, let's say, potentially stop producing ICEs, and also then right down to the economy that is very real today, the impact of the economy on individuals and families to be able to afford an electric vehicle that maybe a year ago they thought, yep, next year is a year for me to buy an electric vehicle. Maybe that's changed now. So all these things, create a lot of uncertainty about that pace of electrification. We can debate that, and today we'll show you some scenarios, and I'm certainly happy to debate them. But I think more importantly today, what is really new for us, and for I don't think really there's any research that exists that really goes to the level of depth that we've looked at the impact on other fluids, such as metalworking fluids. So what's really important is we actually understand at a granular, at a vehicle level, what that impact is. We will today look at questions like how much less removal fluid or coolant is required to produce one EVE versus a ICE, or what opportunity exists in an EV that didn't exist in an ICE for you. And then we want to help you answer some more general business questions like how reliant, looking at this information, how reliant is my future business on current product potential volumetric declines, and what signals do you need to be tracking to understand, let's say, what scenario might take place in the overall kind of speed of electrification. So if you just flick to the next slide, Jason, and I'll really go through, we'll quickly touch on what else we're sort of covering today. Other key points to understand is about, as I said, opportunities in lubricants, what fluids are declining and how much and where, and the boundaries of this work in terms of geographic coverage. Today, we're really focusing on the US in great detail, but you'll also learn about other markets because it's about showing you the fundamentals of how we've come to this, come to some of these conclusions. But the broader scope of work that we've done does cover the other markets. We'll be presenting, I believe, on the 14th of December, a follow-up session on other markets. So we do cover pretty much the globe and the full research, and you will be able to download that report from the ILMA membership portal on the website. So you will have access to the full report. And as I mentioned, we will be showing various scenarios today around the forecast, because when we look out to 2040, there is reasonable uncertainty there. So that's sort of what we're covering. If you flick to the next slide, Jason, I'll quickly talk through the very specific agenda. Oh, I won't. I'll show you a list of, there's in the deck, there's all the list of acronyms that we'll be using. The top one is actually the most important, that sometimes people don't know the term park. This is a European term for all registered vehicles. So we often refer to the car park, and there's PARC, the car park. And this is the size of the number of vehicles in a particular geographic region. So this is obviously the foundation of a lot of our models, is this car park by country, but also you'll have all the other acronyms there for your reference, and definitions as well. If we look at the specific agenda, Jason's going to talk us through the various technologies, vehicle technologies, and why some have won and some have less successful, as well as some of the strategies of the OEMs and how that's looking out to the future. Then Gabrielle will walk us through the metalworking fluid results and some of the assumptions about where we see the change in fluid demand. We'll flick back to Jason then, and he's going to talk us through the PCMO demand outlook, the EV sale outlook. And then we'll look at the opportunities that come out of electric vehicles, in which there are quite a few. Then we'll touch upon the Canadian market and look at some of the implications there, and then a couple of key takeaways. That should cover, we should be, hit these sort of probably under an hour, which will leave us plenty of time for questions. As I said, please don't hesitate to look in the chat and put your questions in the Q&A. So with that, I'll hand over to Jason. Thanks.
Thank you, Annie. Hello, everyone. So that was a good introduction, and I'm not sure how much everyone is aware of, but to start off and put us all on the same page, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the technology, because at the heart of this, we're talking about a transition of technology. Obviously, the implications of transitioning from BEVs or from ICEs to BEVs or some sort of other drivetrain. The implications to lubricants and fuels is obviously huge in our world, but at the heart of this is a transition from technology. So let's just review a little bit about the technology that's on the table, and then some possible scenarios. Through our models, you'll see that we're very battery EV centric. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, hybrids have been around for a while, but they've never really caught on the way I think some people would have liked for them to catch on. Two, OEMs aren't necessarily a huge fan of producing them. They're a very complicated piece of machinery, right? We're going from an ICE vehicle that's already a complicated amalgamation of parts and mechanical components, and we're also adding basically a BEV into it as well. So it's not necessarily an OEM's favorite thing to manufacture, whereas BEVs are actually quite simple. We do get some questions about fuel cells, but on the consumer market where this project is really focusing, we're not really seeing fuel cells as a potential threat to the market at this point. Now, of course, that is a different story if we were to talk about the commercial sector, where fuel cells are more of a viable technology and drivetrain on the commercial side. But on the consumer side, we're really focused around battery electric vehicles. This is the piece of technology that has really been growing recently. Obviously, we know Tesla, we know Lucid, we know Rivian. Tesla has already proven themselves as to be basically a major U.S. auto manufacturer at this point. We have, threats from Lucid. They're pretty small and still young. And of course, Rivian, where they're big on paper, they're not producing a huge amount of vehicles, but they are backed by Amazon, and they are already delivering last mile delivery trucks to Amazon, and so they might be a threat in the future. But this is the technology that we see winning in the future. So a little bit about the timeline and how we sort of develop our models from the very get-go. So what we're doing is looking at the past. Looking at how the market has already started to transition from ICEs to electric vehicles. We're looking at what the OEMs have been doing. Obviously, we have to look at Tesla and the startups on the electric vehicle side. And of course, moving forward, we're looking at what the government is trying to do in terms of incentives for consumers, in terms of purchasing incentives, and also on the OEM side, because there are also incentives to try to get OEMs to start manufacturing more domestically, but also trying to manufacture more on this side as the administration is more prone or favors EVs over ICEs at this point. And so a couple of the highlights to make. There's a push by the administration to install 500,000 charging stations in the nation. So when we look at possible implications or impacts or drivers to some of these scenarios, we don't necessarily see charging stations to be one of them at this point. Now, obviously, if those numbers change, that could change the scenario a little bit. But at the moment, the infrastructure is not necessarily a big of a threat to this transition as maybe previously thought. Also, the Biden administration is trying to target 50% of EV sales by 2030. And if you look at the major OEMs like Ford and GM, Stellantis, this also rings with them as well. This is sort of what they're trying to accomplish. We all know, and I think you know better than us, that these major OEMs are shuttering ICE or internal combustion engine plants and in favor of battery production facilities and also EV production facilities. We know that GM and Ford are investing billions into battery plants and EV assembly plants, right? This is where they're trying to move forward. And so this is where we see the market going. So we take all this information and we basically develop some models with some scenarios. So the first thing we do is we're trying to gather vehicle data and create models of sales and also production, because we're looking at PCMO and also metalworking fluids. So when we're taking the sales data and modeling that in the future, and this is where this is how we're adding to the current car park. And obviously this has huge implications to PCMO, right? Because as a BEV displaces an ICE, that is basically removing 100% of that ICE's oil from the marketplace. And on the other side, when we're looking at production to meet demands from the models in terms of ICEs and BEVs, the production of BEVs and ICEs and the various different types of technology to meet the sales demands. This transitions directly to metalworking fluids. And then we're adding some other model assumptions, right? So obviously sales goes directly into adding into the car park, but then we have to on the other side remove the scrappage, right? Removing the older vehicles from the park that have been around and they're ready to be moved on, either be sold internationally or actually literally being scrapped. And also a component of this are the subcomponents and the parts of the vehicles themselves. And of course, we want to look at modeling the future. We need to understand what are the incentives? What are the incentives from the consumers and what are incentives from the OEMs? So the administration is playing a role in this, obviously in terms of infrastructure and also incentives. And of course, these are also these same targets that the OEMs are publicly announcing, right? Ford, GM, Stellantis, they all are moving towards 50% EV sales by 2030. That is their goal. That is what we know that they're doing. There are some, I would say some people lagging behind a little bit. Toyota is one to note just because they tend to talk out of both sides of their mouth at the moment, but they are still hedging their bets. They're still investing billions of dollars into their North Carolina plant in terms of batteries and also EV manufacturing. And so they're getting on board too. And at the very end of this, we take these models with cars and the park, and then we churn it through our knowledge of PCMO, at metalworking fluids, and also EV fluids to arrive at a quantitative output. And with that, we're actually going to go right into some of the implications with metalworking fluids. And so I'm going to turn it over to Gabriel.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Moving to the metalworking fluids part. Next slide, please. So here, firstly, we started looking at the total metalworking fluid demand by end use in North America. We took this number from our analytics division, from our market research division, which surveys the market every 2-3 years for metalworking. We found out that 40% of the total metalworking fluid demand lies with the transportation sector, of which 28% goes to the consumer automotive, 8% to aerospace, and 4% to other, which includes commercial automotive. So that's about 51 million gallons for consumer automotive, which is the main target of this study. Now, Fiat Chrysler, Ford, and GM have actually nearly 200 assembly plants in the US, as well as other manufacturing and distribution facilities. And we move forward to the next slide. Here on this slide, we're trying to look at how does the metalworking fluids feed into the manufacturing of parts for various vehicles. So first, you look at the body of the vehicles, and there is not much change between a hybrid or a BEV or an ICE. There is pretty much the same body structure. So there is no change in the metalworking fluids used for the body of the vehicle. On the drivetrain parts, hybrids have a more sophisticated drivetrain with more parts than ICE, but it's just slight differences. On the BEV, on the other hand, you have a simple drivetrain with fewer parts compared to ICE and a very simple system. In terms of engine, which has the highest consumption of metalworking, and then engines are traditionally smaller in hybrids compared to ICEs, and there is also a small e-motor installed. For the BEV, there is at least one e-motor, and there is no combustion engines or engine block. In terms of battery, for hybrids, there is a small battery, typically built on aluminum housing. And for a BEV, there's a large battery incorporated, built on aluminum housing as well. And new battery pack systems act as one big body structure, linking the front and rear of the underbody parts. Other parts, there's a slightly larger cooling system than compared to an ICE when you look at hybrids, which makes sense because they also have the battery and the e-engine. On the BEV side, there's a larger cooling system with more pipes and compared to the ICE. And this comes due to the battery. There's a need to cool down the battery and also the electronics. Other parts eliminated when you look at BEVs versus ICEs include radiators, fuel tanks, exhaust pipes, crankshafts, fuel pumps, mufflers, camshafts, and exhaust manifolds. On the next slide, here, going forward, reverting to the 2 slides from before, 51 million gallon was the magic number for the metalworking fluid consumption in consumer automotive. If we split them into various product categories, you have 60% for removal fluids, 40 for about 30% to forming fluids, and 5% for protecting and treating fluids each. Now, I know in North America, people refer to removal fluids as coolants. We at Kline, we call them removal fluids, and we call coolants the antifreeze, which is used for vehicles. In terms of product category, for hybrids, there is a slight reduction in removal fluids, and this comes due to the fact that engines tend to be smaller than your typical ICE. But there is a slightly higher consumption in drivetrain manufacturing because hybrids have a more complicated drivetrain with more parts compared to ICE. On the removal fluids front for BEVs, there is a significant reduction because there is no thermal combustion engine, and there is low consumption in drivetrain manufacturing because BEV have fewer parts and the drivetrain itself is small. Removal fluids are not used in car body manufacturing in any vehicle type. In forming fluids, there is a slight increase for hybrids, and this is due to the wiring, the casting of the e-motor and battery housing. The car body design has not changed, as mentioned before. And for BEVs, in terms of forming fluids, there is no change for still the same body as mentioned previously. In terms of protecting fluids for hybrids, you have a slight reduction, and this is also because there is a smaller engine. For BEVs, there is a moderate reduction, which is slightly higher than for hybrids. There's a lower consumption in drivetrain manufacturing because BEVs have fewer parts and the drivetrain is way smaller than an ICE. For treating fluids, there is a slight reduction for hybrids. And this is also because of the smaller engines. In BEVs, there's a significant loss, the medium loss of treating fluids because of the lack of engine parts, but it's still used. Treating fluids are still used for chassis, suspensions, brakes, and steering. Next slide, please, Jason. So bearing in mind that we assess that removal fluids have the highest impact on the electrification of the cars, we try to look at in a most simple way to assess a hypothetically 100%. If you were to allocate 100% volume for an ICE, how much would it be reduced for your hybrid or your typical BEV? And we come up with some numbers. There is an 8% reduction for a hybrid in removal fluid terms, and a 50% reduction in a BEV, which is half of the volume is essentially lost in terms of removal fluids. And this further feeds into the total consumption of metalworking fluids and results in a 3% overall reduction in metalworking fluids for your typical hybrid and 33% in your BEV, battery electric vehicle. The change in consumption pattern by vehicle type is a contraction in overall metalworking fluids demand. And removal fluids are the most widely used metalworking fluids in engine manufacturing. That's well known. And the drivetrain consumption declines because BEVs have fewer parts and the drivetrain is smaller. And there is a slight increase in metal forming in hybrid systems due to the additional wiring and more die casting, because you look at the e-motor and battery housing. But even in the wiring parts, there is so little wire drawing fluid used for producing those wires. We looked into that market, and even if you were to say the market is growing with 10-15% CAGR, it will still be such a small volume allocated for vehicles, because most of these wire drawing fluids or wires are allocated to constructions rather than to vehicles. So that even there, if there is a bright side on the forming fluids part, it's so small, and it's not even compensating for a tiny fraction of the loss in removal fluids. Back at you, Jason.
Actually, if I just add a little bit here, Gabriel, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I think it really, and we kind of going down from the top to down from the overall market view, where we see only, around third attributed to automotive. So, and those mega trends are really different in those different segments. So, obviously passenger automotive would be the fastest, which will switch to the electric vehicles, hence the highest impact, on the constituent kind of demand in that sector. And within the automotive, also, like just Gabriel went through the different vehicle types, different parts, and ultimately different fluids, the picture is also very, very different and fragmented. While we see a big reduction in the removal fluids, the formal fluids demand would not significantly change per vehicle. And then obviously other die casting, wire drawing, and some of the other smaller applications which Gabriel mentioned. Now, this analysis is really kind of, this slide specifically is per vehicle, but there is one more component which will feed into ultimate forecast for the metalworking fluids, such as how many vehicles are produced. And this is, I think, a transition to Jason, who will share some of their forecast for the sales and park and production, and ultimately that would add up with this analysis and produce the ultimate forecast for the metalworking fluid demand.
Yep. Thanks, Konstantin. Yeah, we wanted to give you some of the output in terms of metalworking fluids and some of the highlights before we start to bore you with kind of the car park and sales models, which is what we're actually going to get into now. So in the report, we have 3 scenarios that we modeled. We have a likely scenario, and we also have a conservative and an aggressive scenario. We're not going to discuss the conservative scenario today. That is in the report. We're going to look at the likely scenario and the aggressive scenarios today. The likely scenario was sort of, when I opened up, we said that the government and also OEMs are sort of targeting 50% of their sales to be EV by 2030. Our likely scenario pushes that back a few years to 2035, just because we're looking at all the OEMs. So even if Toyota doesn't really want to get on board, if they want to stay more hybrid, if that's where they think the trend is going, they may not be producing as many battery electric vehicles. So we push that back a little bit, and also due to some of the speed bumps that we might be feeling along the way in terms of inflation, in terms of the geopolitical issues, also supply chain issues that are still rebounding from the pandemic. And so we just push that back, and that's what we feel like our likely scenario is. And then we'll also talk about the aggressive scenario, which is basically ignoring everything I just said, just saying that everything is going to be a rosy picture. Supply chains aren't going to have an impact. The geopolitical tensions aren't going to be a factor, even though Russia, they do export quite a lot of nickel, and obviously that's a very important component in terms of making batteries. But to sort of look at a likely scenario and look at the aggressive scenario, which is essentially the worst case scenario if you're a PCMO or lubricant supplier. So with that, we'll look at the sales penetration. So what we're looking at is in the dark blue line at the top, we're looking at ICEs, and this is a percentage of sales basically per year going out to 2040. And the orange line are battery electric vehicles. So in our likely scenario, we see the recent trend of increased sales. Now, this is partly due to the rebound of the pandemic and a lot of demand that we saw in 2021 just for car sales in general. Now that's leveled off a little bit in the likely scenario and then picks up again in 5 to 10 years from now. The aggressive scenario on the right, it's basically taking the most recent trends and basically continuing that forward. And we're using a logistics or population growth model and to look at the transition from ICEs to EVs. And this is obviously, again, we're in favor of the BEVs due to the reasons I had said previously, which is that the OEMs They don't want to make ICEs, BEVs, and HEVs, right? They want to, if they're going to transition from one to another, then they're happy making ICEs and BEVs, and they're not going to want to make a lot of HEVs as well in between. So one of the key takeaways in terms of the likely scenario is that we're looking at 50% of total EV sales by around 2035. And on the aggressive scenario, we're moving that up a little bit, close to 2030, which is, well, 2029, which is what the model spits out, but it's very close to the government and OEM targets. When we look about the penetration of the park, which is actually the entire fleet of vehicles in the consumer vehicles in the US, we actually see that even though it's a very strong sales penetration, the impact to the overall park is not quite as dramatic. Obviously, this is going to decrease the amount of ICEs in the park over time, starting almost immediately as the number of Teslas and Ford F-150 Lightnings and Rivians start increasing. And the key takeaway here is that obviously you can see that in the likely scenario, that point at which EVs surpass ICEs doesn't happen until post 2040. And if we look at the aggressive scenario, that actually happens somewhere around 2036, 2037. And so this is what we're sort of comparing and contrasting about a likely and also an aggressive scenario. And so when we're looking at the park has direct implications to PCMO, because as we add one EV, or I should say a battery electric vehicle, into the park, we're removing 100% of that vehicle's motor oil in terms of an ICE. And so the penetration of EV or BEVs into the marketplace actually has a huge impact on the demand for PCMO, which is what we're going to look at right now. Now, that looks very dramatic, where it's kind of a victim of the aspect ratio of the charts. The other ones were sort of like very wide and relatively short, and this one's more square. So it looks to be fairly dramatic. But as you can see, the dark line on top is the likely scenario, and then the blue line is the aggressive scenario. And we can see that this impact it diverges at about 4 or 5 years from now, if you want to compare the two scenarios. But we're looking at a fairly significant decrease in PCMO demand in either case, right? Just because we are expecting there to be a transition. And so the question is, when is that transition going to happen? Is it going to happen in the next 5, 10 years, or maybe 10, 15 years? But we expect that the rate of increase of BEVs into the marketplace is actually going to accelerate. And we're just trying to figure out when that acceleration is going to happen. And of course, whenever that acceleration does happen is actually the impact, this is when the impact is felt the quickest and hardest. But we're actually looking at until 2040, we're looking at a possible 5 to 8% decrease in terms of CAGR over time. And so this is unfortunately one of the outcomes of the transition. On the MWF side, the impact is not as great, and this is because it's a fraction of a fraction, essentially, right? Every vehicle still needs metalworking fluids. Gabriel just outlined, what was different, what is more or less the same, and when we look at this over time, we can see that the impact's not so dramatic. And as Gabriel said before, the bulk of the decrease in demand is in removal fluids. Forming fluids, very negligible impact, and same thing with protecting and treating fluids. Their impact was actually less negligible, or more negligible. So we're looking at the bulk of the difference being from removal fluids due to the reduction, or I should say the removing of the internal combustion engine and all those mechanical parts and machine parts to a BEV, which does not have all those parts and components. Obviously, the removal fluids will be impacted quite heavily.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention also you need the aftermarket. The aftermarket components for the park, because you mentioned before that the park, even though you have an aggressive EV sales, you get the impact of the park you will still have. It's going to be minor. So you still need to get a lot of the aftermarket parts essentially to repair those existing vehicles.
Yes, and so with the scenarios, this is a slide that kind of looks at some of the various drivers that has impacted kind of the what we might think is a likely also conservative and then also an aggressive scenario. And a couple of things to mention, obviously inflation and the chip shortage that we felt quite hard last year. And we are looking at actually a relatively high demand in the US in terms of vehicle vehicle sales. I think all of us who have a car that's less than 5 years old in the US was actually contacted by the dealership asking if we'd like to sell it back to them. And so the demand was actually sky high. Combined with the chip shortage that obviously drove up prices quite considerably. And now we have inflation on top of that. And so the impact of these two things is actually probably going to negatively affect vehicle sales in the future. Now this is probably going to happen all across the board. Obviously ICE and also BEV sales will be, we expect some sort of decline in these sales as the prices of a Tesla has gone from $35,000 to close to $50,000 in the last couple of years. And on the flip side, we do expect in the future things like battery innovations and technology to lower the cost, right? And even if we go back to, well, the first transition of vehicles back to when the Model T came out, right? That vehicle decreased by 50% in about 10 years. And while we're not expecting some sort of dramatic decrease like that, we are still expecting a decrease in the manufacturing and the materials of some of these components. And we think that will be a boon, and we think that will actually drive sales higher. Also, of course, OEM investment, better thermal management, all these things are probably going to have a positive impact into BEV demand. And then, of course, there are some things in the future which we can't really model at this point, like autonomous vehicles, where it might actually decrease the demand for vehicles overall, as it's extremely possible. And people have suggested that maybe households go down what would be a traditional two-car household, maybe down to a one-car household, as autonomous vehicles and Ubers basically can supplement that other vehicle. And of course, the transition to renewable energy, this is also going to have an impact. This is kind of related to grid readiness and whether the US or the globe, or whichever region you're interested in, has the energy in the grid available to support EVs, which obviously are going to be fueled by plugging in, and whether the capacity is there, and also the capacity and the available to produce energy on demand 24 hours a day is there to facilitate a transition. Okay, Gabriel, back to you.
Thanks. So we're going to get into the growth of EV fluids. Next slide, please. Here we're presenting essentially what are the issues, or the also, if there is an issue, there is an opportunity as well. So the biggest challenge will be the dielectric properties, which is across the board, whether you talk about engine oils, greases, coolants, transmission fluids. Dielectric properties are a major aspect of the EV fluids. In terms of engine oils, the major issues are, which formulators are struggling with, is the fretting corrosion of bearings due to vibrations when the hybrid is on battery only mode. There is also the condensation and fuel dilution of engine oils that leads to the sludge formation. And of course, the building of a turbo film in all contact surfaces to ensure the engine durability, especially when the ICE is cold. For the transmission fluids, the electric motor is inside the transmission housing, especially in the DHT type. ATF in some EV configurations are being used for cooling as well. As a result, thermal conductivity and electric resistivity of ATFs have become very critical. Material compatibility, such as copper corrosion, have a major impact as well. For greases, you have the noise, the presence or absence of electrical conductivity, thermal and oxidative stability, but also material compatibility are important. There is also a need of high-speed greases, especially in the dual speed gearboxes. In terms of coolants, which are by far the most interesting and most exciting developments which are currently happening in the market, the dry motor versus wet motor question is still ongoing. Each of these systems have a different types of fluids. There is indirect cooling currently applied in the market. You have MEG and PEG type of fluids, the water glycol. But there is some direct cooling solutions, such as immersion cooling in oil, such in GTL or esters or 3M liquids, which are currently tested in lab environment, but also is being currently applied in Formula E, which is very interesting. The health and safety and environmental concerns are becoming increasingly important performance parameters. Next one. If you look at the aggressive scenarios, which I chose to exhibit here, we see some really interesting CAGRs across the board. You have even engine oils for hybrids have a fast growth, like in the hybrid category, and this comes primarily because you have the service fill, which has shorter drain intervals than your transmission fluid, and therefore you have a higher growth. In BEVs, on the other hand, most of the fluids are factory fill. There is very little service fill for BEVs. Most of the transmission oils and coolants and greases that go inside are claimed by the OEMs to be fill for life, which is something like 7 or 8 years. And there is little opportunity for service fill in the BEV categories, but for hybrids, there is plenty of opportunities and massive growth. For BEVs, also on the coolant side, there could be an innovation over the next few years that could perhaps diminish dramatically the amount of fluid that it needs. If you go away from the water glycol solution, then we wouldn't need such large volumes of coolants or antifreeze, as you may call it. Next one. So in terms of from the blender's perspective, so I had a look at the customization potential. So looking at various product categories, which one of those presents the max opportunities for blenders? And of course, engine oils have very low and medium customization potential. Currently, hybrid engines run at lower temperature more often. They're very similar to the IC start and stop operating design, which has been working for a decade already. Dedicated hybrid engine oils are still a marketing claims, but they're being worked on. So there is not clear whether there is a real engine oil designed purely for hybrids. Your typical 0W20, 0W16 works very well on an IC as well as in a hybrid. There's very little difference, but so far we see just the marketing claims. On transmission fluid side, you have a high potential of customization, especially for the BEVs. In hybrids, you have a variable torque at different speeds, which is achieved only by transmission fluids used in conventional ICE vehicles, and this is very unlikely to change. On the BEV side, you have multi-speed gearboxes, which is currently not produced as far as I know in the US, but this will change over the next few years, especially with the Ford F-150, which has two engines, and they're working on it. Porsche is already using those two-speed gearboxes, and I'm pretty sure in the US you're soon going to have those as well. And the formulators, of course, need to address the corrosion protection and heat transfer in new formulations for BEVs. On the coolant side, there is a lot of development going on. New systems such as immersed battery cooling is being tested in racing cars, as I mentioned before, in Formula E. The zero to low glycol based lubricants display a dual cooling and lubrication function. This is also tested. And if this is really going to take over, then we're going to see a lot less volume than we currently have in the market. On the grease side, there's also a high potential of customization in BEVs and a medium one in hybrids. Of course, your requirements such as thermal stability, anti-corrosives, noise reduction ability, and high dielectric strength are very much desired. The Grease Association is already working to include specifications for grease, gearboxes, electric motors, and other applications. And also the bearing manufacturers, they're working on oils to replace greases in some fast rolling bearings applications. And this is not just for EV fluids, this is happening for other fast rolling bearings as well. Jason?
So in the report, we have we've given Canada a similar treatment to what we just went over with the US, and there's a lot more information. So what I'm just gonna hit some of the highlights in the Canadian market today. And so in the report, we have two scenarios. We have an aggressive scenario and a conservative scenario. I will say that the aggressive scenario is what the Canadian government is targeting, which is basically about 100% of 99% of EVs around 2035. I think they want to be completely EV by 2035. So the aggressive scenario is sort of in line with that. Conservative scenario is pushing that back by 5 years or so. But we're looking at a timeline or a model similar to the US, but pushed up by a few years. So it's actually quite aggressive. And so this will pose some questions about whether the Canadian market can actually go through with this. But right now we will look at some of the implications from the model. So we look at the sales penetration, the little chart up in the top left. We're looking at taking the current trends, and we're also forecasting that forward to basically hit the complete transition by 2035. Now, of course, the implication to the park is quite dramatic as well. Obviously, a lot of the fast and furious sales is going to diminish the ICEs in the overall park, which obviously correlates to quite a decrease in PCMO demand. And on the flip side, in order to meet the sales and production, we also see the decrease, a similar trend that Gabriel outlined with metalworking fluids for the US. We see the same trends in production due to production, right? So the bulk of the decrease comes from removal fluids, and we see almost an increase in forming fluids, and this is just due to the increase of BEV sales. But like I said, Canada has a similar treatment to the US in the report, and there's a lot more information, and that we just wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways from the report. So to sum up, we see that the consumer vehicle market is changing. BEVs are actually are penetrating the marketplace faster than originally predicted from just a few years ago. I don't think anyone actually could have predicted the turnaround Tesla had when starting just a few years ago. They've actually they've done quite well, and they actually turned into like a bona fide US automaker. But there will be some challenges along the way. Some of them we mentioned, like inflation and materials and supply chains. But the real question is, can the supply keep up with demand? We saw that Ford F-150 Lightning sold out overnight, and then shortly after that, they increased the price by $8,000. Is that due to supply and demand, or is that due to the fact that maybe this due to also the inflation, the material prices increasing? It's probably a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. They probably thought maybe we should price these things a little bit higher since they sold out so fast. But we'll see if they can keep up with the demand. But when the transition does happen, we do expect to be a relatively rapid decline in PCMO. The outlook for metalworking fluids is better, just because EVs and BEVs still require metalworking fluids to manufacture the components. And while we do see BEV strengthening the foothold, that also means that we don't see hydrogen fuel cells being a threat to the consumer market at the moment. We do see some opportunities in EV fluids because these fluids will have to evolve to meet the OEM demands and these sort of fill for life promises. And then, of course, the next step would be to see what happens in the commercial sector. The consumer sector is a few steps ahead, and the commercial sector is kind of just starting a transition in terms of some of the fleets. But and that sort of sums up our report or our presentation for today.
Thanks, Jason. And just before I hand back to you, Holly, just a quick couple of comments. Yeah, there was a lot of information we just shared, and there's even more in the full report. And so, we look forward to the questions today, but this is, this is not a one-off event. There's a follow-up session in December. And, once you dig to the full report, maybe you'll have more questions, and we welcome those. This isn't, when we're talking about scenarios, it's always evolving. And so I think it's important as an industry that we discuss this and delve into these assumptions and where things are going. And then finally, I completely think I forgot up front to really thank the ILMA Review Committee that worked with us in reviewing this report, working with the team to give their feedback, to question us, to challenge us. And so I really thank you to those people that really committed a lot of their time outside of from their daily business to work with us on that. So with that, I can hand back to you, Holly, to take us through some of the questions. I think Constantine's been typing some live answers in the chat, but yeah, Holly, over to you.
Sure. One of the first questions that we got has to do with the electric grid. And I know that every presentation that I sit through, I always question how the electric grid is going to manage this transition. We see recently in California, they asked electric vehicle owners not to charge their vehicles because of issues with the electric grid. What are your thoughts about where that needs to go and what the likelihood is that that will be up to snuff?
That's it's an incredibly good question, and I looked at this a little bit, anticipating that question. And so there are a couple of things we need to look at, which is one, basically the net generation in the grid and the forecasted generation in the grid. And this comes straight from the EIA. This is not a model that we spit out. This is coming straight from the EIA. And that's the black line that's dotted up top. And so we're looking at over the next 20 years or so, the net generation to the grid is going to be increasing. Now, if we add the kind of a back of the envelope calculation of what a 100% battery electric vehicle would need being plugged into the grid, those are the two lines we have below, the red line being the aggressive scenario and the light blue line being the conservative scenario. And we can see that the light blue line is kind of on par with the anticipated generation to the grid. Now, that doesn't necessarily take into account all factors, which are one, maybe warmer temperatures moving forward, which would be an increase in HVAC and also electricity. It also doesn't take into account population centers, right? This is an average over the entire nation. So while it's nice to put the BEV demand down on a line, what it does mean is that everybody's charging on average. So it doesn't necessarily account for peak times, right? So if everybody comes home and plugs in at the same time, which tends to be around stereotypically, 4 to 6 p.m., which is also, almost during the peak heat of the day. Especially I'm in Texas, so that's between 2 to 7 in the summer. So right when the demand is highest, do we want people plugging in at the same time? And those of us in Texas know, ERCOT, and keep an eye on the grid sometimes, just because we trying to anticipate when there might be a blackout or a brownout due to peak demand and also lack of production from some of the renewables. However, well, that's the other part, is that we have renewables into the equation as well. When we're talking about thermal power systems, we're talking about demand or an energy production that can be turned on with almost the flip of a switch to meet demand 24 hours a day. When we're moving into renewables, obviously the sun isn't shining at night and the wind isn't necessarily blowing very strong at night. So we need to increase the capacity of renewables over time, just to account for the fact that it's not necessarily on hand or on demand. Now, of course, with that, we also need to increase storage. So, and these things are increasing, and people are moving towards these things in terms of electricity storage, either when you're looking at Tesla putting in their massive battery banks in Texas and some other places as kind of like pilot programs to work in concert with either solar farms or wind farms. It's a very interesting question. Now, I guess the answer to that is the grid ready? Well, I think the simple answer to that in the next couple of years, I think the answer is kind of yes. And obviously that answer gets a little bit more unsure as we move out, and it doesn't account for the population centers like California, where there might be some other issues going on. So it's a very interesting question. However, when we go back to renewables and the increased demand for renewable energy, because the thermal power is being phased out in lieu of solar farms and wind farms, this will actually create quite more, well, solar generate, or not solar, but power generation farms, whether they're solar or wind. And these things are going to be dotted around the states and other countries, and these all have to be tied into the grid. And so there's actually going to be a lot more transmission lines that have to go along with this. So that's actually one of the interesting things that comes out of this, that we don't have a number associated with this, but transformer oils might be an opportunity here as well, just because the extra power generation plants that are needed because they're renewable are going to have to be connected to the grid, and they're not all going to be concentrated in one area. They're all going to be connected separately. So yeah, it's hard to answer that question with a steadfast yes or no, but yeah, it is something to look at over time and see how the grid is transforming as the transition evolves.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, we've gotten a number of questions in here. Here's a good one. Why would OEMs not want to build BEV, HEV, ICE only going in one direction? Shouldn't they want a diverse portfolio? What data confirms this?
I think Gabriel might want to jump in at this point, but because I know he's had actually spoken with OEMs and that they do not want to manufacture all three. Is that correct?
Yeah, most of them they see hybrids as an intermediary technology, just to get consumer used to the idea of a electric engine, right? And most of them want to start to jump right ahead to produce the BEVs, right, and not hybrids, because the margins on hybrids are extremely low. I mean, they need to be competitive. When you produce hybrid, you need to have the ICE engine, you get the E engine, and you get the battery as well, and that needs to be competitive with the ICE, which is very hard to do. So their margins tend to be extremely small on hybrids and quite high on BEVs. So all of them want to produce BEVs as soon as possible, as fast as possible. Now, some companies are sensible and they keep the door open for hybrids. They say, okay, we keep producing hybrids or ICEs until 2025. And we go with hybrids and electric and full electric vehicles until 2030. Others say, no, we jump straight to BEVs and no hybrids, or as little hybrids as possible. So it's a profitability question for most OEMs. And this is also for commercial vehicles, not just for passenger cars. I was very surprised when I spoke to Daimler, for instance. Very surprised.
Okay, thank you. I've gotten a number of questions about, will the slides be available? And the answer is yes, it will be on the ILMA website. We will have a link on the homepage. You will have to log in, but you will be able to retrieve the slides, as well as this session is being recorded, and we will have the recording available sometime probably later today. So to answer that question, let's see. Someone has requested, can you put the first slide on Canada back up? I guess they want to take another look at that. Any additional points that you want to make about the Canadian market?
Unless we want to, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so it's not much more I can say without pulling up either the model. But
I think one question was about, is that target includes also hybrids, and yes, plug-in hybrids are included, as well as battery electric vehicles. Yeah.
So yeah, we are kind of an acronym hell, but yes, EVs are kind of like the general word we're using for BEVs plus PHEVs plus HEVs. Obviously try to use BEVs when referring solely to BEVs. Now I can't guarantee that I stuck to that during the entire presentation, but yeah, EVs are the general word or acronym for all encompassing.
Yeah.
Right.
One thing we do need to acknowledge is the situation is very, I mean, still a lot of things are not decided completely. You know, in Canada, you know, they pushed the target, for example, from 2040 to 2035. And also there are discussions about, you know, how do we also get rid of hybrids ultimately. So and you know, similarly in other countries, I mean, here in what we compare, especially comparing with the US, you know, Canada is much more, you know, ambitious in those targets. I mean, we will look at other regions as well at some, you know, in a different presentation where, you know, there's different picture by region as well, and how the government's solving, you know, for the for ultimately driving the emissions down is different.
I think, and maybe we can jump back. I think it's slide 18. There's a question here as well, if you don't mind me sort of adding this one in from the list, Holly, about whether we took into account the availability of lithium into the scenarios. Does the likely scenario assume adequate lithium? And the conservative scenario factors possible lithium shortage. You know, that's the specific question, but I think linking to Konstantin's point, you know, these things are uncertain. And from when I bring in the sort of the business view, like you as the sort of operating the business, what do you need to be thinking about? Obviously out of this, there's a lot of numbers you can take and but really you have to say, what are the things I need to be most aware of that are going to drive the scenarios the most, right? What of these factors have the most impact on the scenarios? So those are the ones that are most important to track. Or for you, maybe there's, you know, depending on your business, it might vary. But I think that's the point. Some of these have a small impact and some have a much larger impact. So maybe Konstantin or Jason, you want to kind of talk to that. There's this specific example about the availability of lithium, but maybe more generally as well, how we accounted for those things in our model.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Konstantin.
Okay, maybe I talk generally, and then Jason, if you want to add. I mean, initially when and we've been tracking the you know, electric vehicles, trying to understand the electric vehicles and build different scenarios, you know, for a number of years now. I think initially the biggest kind of the biggest concern was around you know, the cost of those vehicles. It was about infrastructure, you know, charging infrastructure, and also the time it takes to charge. It was about the driving range of the vehicles. And those kind of things has somewhat being solved. You know, the driving range, for example, is in line with ICE. You know, charging infrastructure has been developing rapidly, incentivized by governments and also private investors building charging stations. And also the time to charge has been reduced, you know, depending on the OEM again, you know, down to comparable levels to the ICE, basically. So now it's much more, you know, those kind of longer term factors, well, a bit shorter term with chip shortages but the longer term factors, which is, you know, around the government support for that, government targets and government incentives to OEMs and to the consumers is important. And the other components, you know, which is, you know, one of that obviously is about important one is the cost of the electric vehicles, which is, you know, still very high. You know, it's been coming down, but because of the cost of battery, you know, the biggest component is the cost of batteries within the electric vehicles. You know, the charging infrastructure we discussed. And finally, in terms of the batteries, I think that's definitely one of the concerns, you know, the availability of rare earth metals, which are used in battery production, and whether it would be substantial enough to meet the you know, ambitious production targets for EVs. And I think the answer to that, you know, a lot of that is China, you know, and in Asia, and you know, China is big in terms of production of the electric vehicles. So I mean, and then another part of the answer is recycling, battery recycling, because, you know, to what extent recycling industry can pick up the you know, those batteries which are retiring and put back recycle those rare earth metals to be reused.
Can I just ask a question? I saw an article actually this morning in the Wall Street Journal about lithium iron phosphate battery cells, so that they use less of the rare earth minerals such as nickel and cobalt. Apparently that's the most common battery in China, and that some of the automakers are looking at that, even though there is less range with those batteries, and such as Ford, Rivian, they're all looking at this. Do you think that has the prospect to grow?
I think, Holly, it's a very good question and very right question, and I think we do have to acknowledge that technology it's not idle, and especially battery one, more because as it is the biggest cost within the production of the electric vehicles. All the OEMs, integrated or partnered with the battery companies and trying to reduce costs, as this is really feeding into the competitive advantage of those, cost advantage of those OEMs. So we see a lot of the development technology, going and development around this area. Now, I'm not really as much as I want. I'm not really an expert in this field to say what technology will win, but what we see, yes, cost is going down, and the technology is also changing. So, and we will see what the future will lie for us in this aspect.
Yeah, and I was going to add just that I don't have a lithium example, but I do know that, for example, Tesla has signed an exclusive a contract with a nickel mine in North America. And so I know Tesla has their raw materials, they're looking ahead, they're looking and planning ahead to ensure that they have the raw materials available to meet their own personal demands for manufacturing batteries, whether it's either for their Tesla walls or for their BEVs. Tesla also manufactures lipos, because lithium iron phosphates are traditionally used in the more like solar, storage, but not necessarily like high energy output for maybe like a car when you're smash on the accelerator. But those are the types of batteries that you find in the Tesla walls.
One of our attendees asked, how do you account for the effect of OEMs eliminating ICE vehicle offerings to the adoption rate of BEVs? If OEMs only desire to produce one or the other, wouldn't the elimination of ICEs force consumers' hands, accelerating BEV adoption?
Yeah, exactly right.
That's exactly what will happen.
Yeah, this is also why we have this sort of the logistics population model, because at some point it's the scales are going to tip, and this thing it'll either run away or it will fail. I mean, there's not going to be, I don't think there's going to be a half where there's going to be a half a park that's EV and half a park not for it's going to go one way or the other.
Yeah, I think the mechanisms here is that with the government, it comes with the government targets for the industry and associated targets for OEMs, in terms of the emissions. So it's the OEMs balance the portfolio of different vehicles to align with those targets which are imposed on them, and others like Tesla sells the credits to others. But anyway, I'm not going into that. So ultimately, the picture is changing and the portfolio is changing, and the way we in all of those different OEMs. So the way we account for that in the model, and this is exactly why we were quite focused in the scope. So the scope was solely focused on the consumer vehicles. We excluded commercial vehicles, and we approached it from the because there is a lot of speculations, there is a lot of variables. So we approached it from the very quantitative angle, coming from the forecast for the sales, and different scenarios around kind of adoption of different technologies, aggressive scenario showing faster electrification and also faster transition to battery electric vehicles, which ultimately result in the bigger impact on to lubricants. So those sales scenarios then feed into our model, where we say, okay, what is the total vehicle park? So some vehicles are retiring because of the age, some vehicles are coming in. So ultimately we quantify how much, what is the vehicle park, vehicles in use, how much out of that is electric and battery electric, hybrids and ICE, and that was then quantified towards the lubricant, with the assumptions about drain intervals, the sump size, and so on. It will quantify it into the overall demand for PCMO. And equally with the metalworking, again, it's those scenarios are based on the quantification of the market. They are based on the sales, based on the forecast for the vehicle production in the US, which is in part driven by the forecast for the demand. So the kind of OEMs try to in their production obviously try to transition as well. And then again, this is all the model ties up everything together. It uses production, it uses the assumption per vehicle, which was Gabriel was showing how much reduction of removal fluids or forming fluids per type of vehicle for one vehicle, and the total production is multiplied by assumption per vehicle, which is then gets us to the overall demand for metalworking fluids. And I think there was one question as well about kind of what is the numbers we're showing for metalworking fluids. So all the numbers in the presentation are related to metalworking fluids which are consumed in automotive manufacturing. Yeah, so
consumer automotive.
Consumer automotive. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I did the breakdown at the very beginning of the slide when I started.
One slide was just giving that a third of overall metalworking is the consumer automotive, but all the other numbers basically they are looking into consumer automotive only, and therefore you can we see kind of those electrification trends much more much visible. If we aggregate it to the overall metalworking fluids, obviously there are many other sectors where metalworking fluids are used: primary metals, fabricated metals, aerospace, all the others. So the electrification trend will be much less visible.
If I can just add an example to kind of clarify, there's a couple of questions here really about the scenarios, right, and how likely things are to happen, and linking through back to this question about, well, if OEMs only make EVs, then people can only buy EVs. If the US is in that point of time right now where there is a lot of uncertainty about when the acceleration may happen. If you look at a market like China, the uncertainty is far less. The story is pretty much told. OEMs there are making EVs, and people are only soon going to be able to buy EVs. And so as that question rightly says, consumers will be forced down that direction. Obviously, the government has an ability to mandate things and make things happen. So I think when you see when you start to compare countries, and then you can understand how the drivers differ by each country, it will help you understand how the assumptions play out in your own market, if that makes sense, because China is probably an extreme example of where electrification for passenger vehicles is really happening, and the decline is much faster there than let's say in the US.
Okay, thanks, Annie. We can't answer every question today, but I think that we've done a good job on touching on addressing most of the concerns that have been raised. This presentation today was focused on Canada and the US, and we have part 2 of the presentation, which will be Europe, the Asia Pacific, Latin America, and so on, which is scheduled for December 14th. And you'll be getting an email with information about how to register for that coming soon. I want to thank the team at Kline for an excellent job today. Thank you for your presentation. It was very eye-opening. And also our sponsor, Chevron Oronite. Thank you, Chevron Oronite, for your support over the last couple of years. It's been extremely helpful to get this information out to the members. If you have any other questions, please feel free to email me at halfano@ilma.org, and we will try to make sure that these questions are addressed as final report comes out. Again, it'll all be on the ILMA website. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you, and we'll be in touch soon about the upcoming session.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Pleasure to
Thank you,
speak
everyone.
today.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Everyone.